Hello. In my last video, I talked about general theory of money, what it is, how it works, and I started talking about inflation with the seeming paradox that in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the United States issued an unprecedented amount of money to bail out major financial institutions, multiple major financial institutions, and absorbing all of their losses. A huge increase in the effective money supply. And a lot of monetary purists were screaming, oh my God, the sky is falling. We're going to have horrendous inflation. And yet there wasn't any. And I said, okay, why? And I suggested the reason why we did not see inflation at all after the 2008 2009 crisis is due to the velocity of money essentially being very low. That is, if there's a dollar in the economy and somebody obtains that dollar and puts it in their bank account and does nothing with it, that dollar is dead. Effectively, the bailouts of the large financial institutions and then the Dodd-Frank regulations that followed required them to hold more capital on their books. Lending standards tightened, fewer loans were made, housing prices went down, at least initially. And so the velocity of money was very low, and all that increase in M2, the money supply, did not cause inflation. All right, let's look at why then did inflation suddenly begin to rear its ugly head in 2021 and then become a hydra in 2022 that the Federal Reserve has been battling ever since by a very rapid escalation in interest rates. I'm sure you're all aware of that. And it's having a hard time bringing it down. And there's also fears of a recession. If you listen to news on YouTube or a multitude of other social media, you can hear all kinds of extravagant and contradictory claims about what's going to come next. For example, I've seen videos saying literally hyperinflation in the next 90 days, all banks to collapse, or on the contrary, major depression looming, severe disinflation, crash in the stock market. Stock market is rallying on hopes of rate cuts. Okay, so what is it? But, I'll get into that in the third video. The point is, I know there's a lot of very contradictory and confusing information out there in social media. And I hope, if I can, to clear up some of the confusion. But let's go back to why did inflation become a problem just in the last couple of years, more than a decade after the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and massive printing of money at that time, which resulted in no inflation. Okay, well, the Federal Reserve held the prime interest rate, that is, the interest rate that it charges to banks, which are its customers, um, at effectively zero for a decade. From 2008 to 2018, the Federal Reserve was charging basically nothing for banks to lend money. And every time it made any effort to raise rates, the stock market went into a tizzy. You might have heard the term temper tantrum. for fear of rising rates and that it would kill the economy. And so the Fed just stayed put, at interest rates of maybe 1/4 of 1%. Uh, well, that can be very inflationary. When you can borrow money at virtually no interest cost, that certainly encourages you to borrow and spend the money. So we had very low interest rates, and yet that still didn't do it for a decade. Then COVID hit. And here's the real genesis of the inflation problem. If you remember in 2020, when the US said, oh my God, we have COVID in the country, we don't, a lot of people are dying. We have to shut everything down, as many people as possible. We need them not to be in contact with each other. They should be 6 feet apart if possible. They got to wear masks or just work from home. A lot of businesses shut down. A lot of people were at home. And then, because of the fear that the whole economy would collapse because so many people weren't working, they weren't earning anything, they weren't producing anything. The government, in both the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and government, the legislature, the executive branch, they unleashed a whole cluster bomb of money, as Ben Bernanke once said. If you just dropped money out of a helicopter, it would help stimulate the economy. Well, we dropped money out of helicopters unlike any napalm seen in Vietnam. We had the largest increase in the money supply after COVID that we've ever seen in the history of the United States since it had a single currency. It was the money increase in the money supply in 2008, 2009, in response to the financial crisis, was dwarfed. It looked like a foothill in comparison to the amount of money we created in response to the COVID crisis to avoid economic collapse. All right, so the first response we had was a whole bunch of people staying at home. Not all workers, obviously. Some people still had to go to work. Police had to go to work. Firemen had to go to work. EMS had to go to work. But a lot of teachers weren't going to work. Kids weren't going to school. A lot of people were sitting at home. They were afraid to go to the stores and buy things, or the store was closed. They were getting the stimulus checks. Everybody called them stimmy checks, sarcastically. They had this money rolling in. They had nowhere to go shopping. They were afraid to go to a restaurant. They couldn't go to the theaters. What did they do? They wanted home improvements. They wanted to buy stuff for their home. At the same time, China, our probably single biggest supplier of produced goods, they were locked down. So they weren't making the goods and they weren't shipping the goods. We had a crisis of production. We had a crisis of distribution at the same time that we had a surge in demand. At first, it was for home projects. Let's get a new refrigerator. Let's get a new piece of furniture. Let's redo the patio. Let's repaint. Let's all buy a new computer. All the things people watch Netflix. All the things people could do at home. There was a huge demand, and supply was squeezed. The law of supply and demand says prices must go up. So we saw the prices of many goods skyrocket, and the availability just wasn't there, or sometimes at virtually any price. For a while, shipping costs went up tenfold or more. per container to ship, across the ocean, which is a major form of goods entering the United States. Uh, we also had the suspension of student loan repayments. If students were not being required to pay back their loans, and this is a hundreds of billions of dollars worth of loans, suddenly they could use that money for other things. That's inflationary. We had free money being given to businesses. Well, officially it was loans, I think. I'm not sure how many of them have ever been paid back, but you remember the government said, well, if you were forced to close your restaurant because you couldn't make money with people having to be socially distant, 6 feet apart, wear masks. How can you eat, when you're wearing a mask? A lot of restaurants closed. They never reopened. Many of them never reopened. So stimulus checks went out to businesses to try to keep them from going bankrupt and hopefully to rehire their workers when things opened up again. And if the supply disruptions from China weren't bad enough, then in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Suddenly there was a panic about the availability of food around the world because Ukraine happens to be the largest grain basket exporting to the rest of the world. There was a panic about gasoline and diesel price availability and natural gas availability. Remember somebody, still not known for sure who, blew up the Nord Stream gas pipelines that supplied natural gas to Europe from Russia. And the US tried to talk European allies into boycotting Russian oil, which was one of the handful of major suppliers of oil to the world. It didn't stop Russia from exporting oil, but what it did force Russia to do was export mainly to China and to some other India and some other willing buyers at a discount because it was in violation of the sanctions. But anyhow, there was concerns about a shortage of oil, a shortage of natural gas, on top of the existing shortages caused by COVID. So commodity prices exploded. Then we had a whole barrage of economic sanctions and tariffs. It started with the Trump administration wanting to punish China for its unfair, I guess, first of all, it's stealing so many American manufacturing jobs. Not that we tried very hard to keep onto them. We were happy to let them go to China for a long time, but then stealing our intellectual property, its unfair trade practices. It would export freely, but it wouldn't allow imports. So, Trump was going to be tough on China, also tough on Europe. He raised a bunch of tariffs on a bunch of European products. Well, when you raise tariffs or you try to boycott producers, what is the end result? Consumers in the United States that want those things face a shortage. And once again, the law of supply and demand dictates prices will go up as a result of tariffs, as a result of sanctions. It drives prices up. There was another reason. Deglobalization. Suddenly we realized, maybe China is not the one and only country we should be relying on to supply our produced goods for a whole lot of reasons, but the COVID lockdowns kind of reinforced that. Maybe we shouldn't rely on Russia so much for some things. because look what they're doing. They're using it as they used it as an economic weapon. So suddenly there were all kinds of companies started thinking about, you know, near shoring, onshoring, friend shoring. In other words, moving their suppliers of components or goods from China to closer locations, or maybe even within the United States. And also, they started looking at multiple supply sources where they formerly only had one. That's smart business, and it was always dumb business to rely on one supplier. But the point here is when you try to change a major supplier of your iPhone or your aluminum siding or whatever, your industrial pipe, whatever it is, from one source, you try to move it to another source or multiple sources. This costs money and it takes time. This also tends to drive up prices. So we're experiencing a deglobalization. It's not going to be a total deglobalization, of course, but the amount of free trade that we had for several decades with very low or no tariffs. We had a functioning agency to resolve trade disputes that kind of became non-functional. That has reversed. We're in a trend now of relative deglobalization, higher cost. There was also a lowering of taxes on the wealthy. That may have contributed some to inflation, maybe not as much as we might think, because after all, when the government taxes people, whether they're billionaires or middle class, whoever, they always spend those tax dollars, right? So it's not like the dollars were taken out of the economy. Actually, they were just repurposed to other things that the government wanted to spend money on. But often they weren't the things that consumers wanted. So that tended to drive up consumer prices and maybe drive up prices in other areas. And then when we started, it was gradually and then all at once to lift all the COVID restrictions and try to get back to business as usual. A lot of firms found that the people that they had laid off when they couldn't function due to the lockdowns and the mandates and so on, they couldn't rehire them. Either they had gone on to other jobs or they had essentially decided to stop working forever, or they were trying to form their own business from home. Restaurants, it's particularly the leisure industry. Restaurants, nightclubs, hotels, motels, travel agencies, anybody that relies on tourism and evenings out, theaters, and so on. They found they couldn't get the workers back that they had before COVID. We see people now companies now that have had to double their wage offers for unskilled workers, or more than double their wages. If they were paying, I don't know, $15 an hour, they couldn't find anybody. Now they're offering $30 an hour. That's inflationary too. So there were a whole host of reasons, I'm saying, why inflation became a big, big problem after COVID. Because the first reaction was the government issuing a truly unprecedented amount of new dollars into the system. And this time, it didn't just go to big banks that would just hold it there on their balance sheet as reserves, proving that they were trustworthy or they were good risks. No, this time it went to households all across the US. They spent some of that money. It's true they put some of that money in savings and then they spend it later. Um, unprecedented increase in the money supply. Continuation of essentially zero interest rates, encouraging borrowing and spending, and supply chain shortages. And then there was labor shortages. Speaking of which, why is it that we have such an extremely low unemployment rate today? Like multi-decade low. Hasn't been seen in a long, what, unemployment rate of 3.5%, something like that. It's not just because everybody has nice full-time jobs. Oh no. If for one thing, a lot of people that were out of work for a while, yes, they found jobs again, but now the jobs are contract jobs with no benefits. They had to go back to jobs of lower pay. They're trying to run a business of their own somewhat unsuccessfully. An awful lot of people retired because we were already facing a demographic crisis. The baby boom, the boom in our population that occurred at the end of World War II, when all those dads that made it through the war came back home and said, let's start a family now. The war is over. So it was 1945 to 1950 period. I'm toward the end of that baby boomer population, but we had a huge surge in population after World War II. Well, now it's 2023. Kids that were born in 1940, 1950, let's say, to make it round numbers, they're 73 years old now. They're leaving the workplace. A lot of them, especially if they were in physically demanding jobs, and their job maybe shut down for a while due to COVID, said, I'm too old to go back to work now. I'm actually comfortable being at home. An awful lot of people have just retired early. They said, that's it. I'm not going back. So the percentage of the labor force that is like between 18 and 65, the percentage of the labor force that is actually actively looking for a job, and that's how we count unemployment, is kind of at an all-time low, at least in the modern era. So when you read about this very low unemployment rate, it's misleading because a lot of people have decided, I'm not going back to work. I took early retirement, or I managed to get on disability, or I'm just going to work as a freelancer from home and I don't care if I have benefits or not. Pretty soon I'll get Social Security, whatever. The unemployment rate is not as low as it looks, but it still has driven up costs for labor. These are all the reasons why suddenly in relative terms, after 2020, inflation became a big problem. We really saw it in 2022 because businesses started opening up again. Supply chain tangles got resolved. People were able to buy things again, go out again, go traveling again. There was a huge surge in demand, and there had been an enormous surge in the money supply. So we had both an unprecedented increase in money supply and a surge in the velocity of money. And in some cases, still shortages driving up costs. At this point, it's particularly shortages in some sectors of the labor market, causing companies much higher costs to hire and retain workers. Not so much right now, the shortage of materials, which we were faced with in 2020 and 2021. So that's the fundamental causes of why inflation, which had been running below 2%, that was the Federal Reserve's target. For years, it had been running below 2%. And then all of a sudden, holy mackerel, the inflation rate is 9% in the United States a few months back, before the Federal Reserve started to hike interest rates to try to decrease demand and slow inflation. Now, if you think that this is a mainly bad US policy, I want to quote a few figures. These are from the most recent issue of The Economist magazine, March 25th, 2023. Inflation has also been a worldwide phenomenon post-COVID-19. Give you just a couple of outstanding examples. Well, first of all, Britain, its inflation rate just within the last couple of days came in hotter than they had expected at 10 point some percent. They were expecting 9%, 9 point some percent. Came out as 10 point some percent. We had 9% a few months ago, and now it's down to a mere 6%, which is still like 3 times or more higher than it used to be. But think about this. The value of other currencies related to the dollar really matters to inflation in other countries, because so many of their transactions, everything they import, it's usually denominated in dollars. So if their currency drops related to the dollar, suddenly they got to pay a whole lot more of their currency to buy the same goods. All right, so Lebanon's pound is the worst performing so far this year, the worst. The Syrian pound, it fell from 47 Syrian pounds to the dollar in 2011. This year, it's 47. It's now 7,550 Syrian pounds to the dollar. So how much coffee do you suppose, or oil, or Game Boys, or whatever you can import at that rate? Iran, maybe takes the cake. It was doing poorly beforehand. In 2018, it was 45,000 reals. That's the name of their currency, reals. 45,000 reals to the dollar in 2018. But recently it reached a low of 580,000 reals to the dollar. In short, their currency is maybe not even worth the paper they're printing it on. That's over 500,000 reals to the dollar. Figure out how much fractions of a cent each one is worth. Oh, before 1979, before the Islamic Revolution, it was 70 reals to the dollar. Then after the revolution, until we walked away from the nuclear deal with Iran, it was 45,000. And now just recently it was 580,000. So many parts of the world are experiencing extreme, actual hyperinflation. Europe is experiencing mostly worse inflation than the United States. I just gave Great Britain as an example. The US, we reached a peak of 9 point some percent per year inflation, which is something that it's outside of many people's memories. But back in the years when Paul Volcker was chairman of the Federal Reserve, we had inflation rates higher than that. And for a while, interest rates were jacked up to 20% and higher. So we've gone through a long secular decline in inflation and in interest rates that kind of bottomed out with Federal Reserve prime rates at 0.25% and inflation running below 2% to post the turmoil of COVID, the panic of COVID. We didn't know what we were dealing with at first. We were having a whole lot of deaths. And then the recovery from that saw a big surge in inflation. And suddenly the Federal Reserve woke up and said, oh, guess this isn't transitory inflation, just kind of a natural reaction to things opening up. It looks like it's more persistent. We've got to fight it. And they have raised interest rates at the fastest pace we've actually ever seen interest rates rise since we had a Federal Reserve Bank, from about 0.25% to 4.5% to 5%. And we're not sure where it's going to end. But that's my story on why inflation became a problem in the last couple of years, and the initial comments about what the U.S. Federal Reserve has done trying to fight it, that it has come down maybe a third from 9% to 6% in the U.S., still remains extremely elevated in some places of the world and higher than the U.S. in other places. Yes, lower than the U.S. in some places. But, and then third, I hope the final video about this series, I want to talk about the consequences of trying to fight inflation. And what do we see next? Coming back to what I said in the beginning of the video, you hear all kinds of predictions of doom, anything from hyperinflation within 90 days to total collapse of the banks, to a recession worse than 2008, 2009, to actually the stock market is going up. So talk about it next time. And thank you for listening.